Right now on Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News, protests persist across the country.
As a member of the community, you want to be very loud and vocal, you want to be assertive and heard.
And no matter which part of the political spectrum you fall on, your right to protest is a constitutional guarantee.
You do have the right to organize as long as you do it peacefully.
So we have this long history of balancing our right to protest with the right of the government to enact order.
But there are some limits to this freedom of expression. This week we're exploring your right to assemble and shout your views publicly. Welcome to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando Frescas. Each week in a partnership between Denver7 and CPR, we have a Real Talk about issues impacting underrepresented people across Colorado and amplifying voices you may not always hear.
And this week we're taking a look at your right to protest. Over the past 6 months here in Colorado, we've seen pro-gun protests, anti-immigration enforcement demonstrations, and a number of other protests where Coloradans express their frustrations. The vast majority have remained peaceful, while others have ended in arrests and violence.
Let's take a look at what the Constitution says about protests. The First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances."
But where can you protest? When can you assemble? And is there a certain legal or acceptable way to, quote, petition the government? Joining us now is Robert Huffman and Alex Burrell with Rise Up Media, who have really tapped into their rights to protest here recently. Robert, I know that you recently attended the Ice Out protest in Denver. I want to thank both of you so much for being here for this Real Talk.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So you've attended protests both as members of the media and as regular citizens. Have you felt a difference between the two experiences?
Absolutely. It's like a day and night situation in some cases.
In
How
what
so?
ways? Yeah.
So as a member of the community, you want to be very loud and vocal, you want to be assertive and heard. But as a member of the press, you're supposed to be sustained and held back. And so you find yourself in a conflicting battle. Do I chant, do I organize, or do I film and document?
Alex, what about you?
I honestly agree with Robert as well. I have seen that as the press, it does get a little bit harder because being a member of the press at these protests, you seem to have a target on your back almost, where people are more likely to come and yell and get in your face because you are recording everything. And it's getting, it's a little wild out there sometimes.
It is. I can say as someone who's covered protests, it's interesting because people think you have a level of protection, but really sometimes you are the target of frustration from demonstrators themselves. Sometimes police, law enforcement are telling you to get out of the way. It sometimes feels like you're nobody's friend when you're a member of the media covering these demonstrations.
Yeah, and, for protesters, apart from the media, are there ways that you're working to educate them, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, to say, hey, it's okay for you to stand up and say this is something I believe in?
Absolutely. So at every single protest, we have business cards on us that are red and we state know your rights. It's very important to know that you have the absolute right to protest. You don't need a document to state that you have the right to protest. But with that, because of laws and new mandates and across the board, you've seen it, it's very important to us to have cards that I can put in your hand in multi-languages that state, here are your rights of protest, here are your rights of obligation, and then here's what happens if you get arrested.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through some of the rights that are listed on those cards?
So some of the rights that we've listed on the cards that we've made, because we've had red cards before, which were specifically for migrant rights, but we've created some that have for protest rights. It's pretty much all the same laws that the ACLU states, that you do have the right to protest peacefully, you do have the right to organize. Of course, when I say peacefully and organize, you do have to do it within the boundaries of the law, so you can't be sitting there blocking traffic. If you are blocking traffic, that can technically be followed up with multiple different charges that the police can charge you with. So the ACLU does state that, hey, you do have the right to organize as long as you do it peacefully. You do not need a permit. as long as it is not getting wild or anything like that.
And I think along with that, there may be people who are listening or watching saying, I do want to go to protest, but it may get wild and I may be involved in something where I may not feel safe. Are there recommendations for people who are not trying to do something more than say, I want to hold a sign and
I can answer that.
Yeah,
It's very important to know who you're protesting with. And so there are a lot of bad actors out here, in my opinion, and I'm not going to name any. They know who they are. But at the end of the day, if you're going to go to the protest, it doesn't need to be a matter of, hey, let me take a selfie and post it on social media. It's a matter of, let me actually be here for my community. So I always say, if you really want to know where and what happened, Reddit is not the location to do it. There's the inaccurate information, the misinformation, and that's why Alex and I are trying to build a location for said information. But truthfully, if you are just a person that wants to go, I say go. Bring a friend, bring your kids, bring your family, but at the same time understand that there are a group of people that want chaos, that want action, and they want to sow disruption. And so it's very important that when you see bad actors, especially if you're just going as a bystander or even a person holding a sign, you publicly shame them, because this is our city, this is our home, this isn't a war zone, and this isn't an establishment that we're trying to break down.
Tell us a little bit more about what you're building to help track protests and track things that are going on around our city.
Absolutely. So we have built an AI program, multiple programs that consist of over 30,000 different independent AI nodes. And what we've done is we figured out how to track real-time data, such as protesting data, where, how, when. We've also figured out how to secure that data, ensuring that it can't be abused, it can't be disrupted. And we've created a central location to where mainly advocates right now can use it, where they can say, hey, this happened, or we saw this, or actually we need this call to action. So the whole reason that we created the Favored Data tool was we got tired of misinformation, getting banned from social medias, getting banned from Reddits and things of that nature. And I took it upon myself to use an old baseline of a Huffman code and turned it into an entire cool array of just accurate information on things that are happening in real time. And so we're attempting to do something that I don't think has been done before, and that's using accurate data, and then on top of it, allowing for, if say it gets quoted as misinformation, for it to be actually subjected to, no, this is misinformation. So that's kind of where it started. We're just trying to find a centralized location to where folks don't feel like they have to pay for a paywall or anything to find information like that.
So what do you feel, final question as you wrap up, Alex, what do you feel is the biggest threat to the right to protest today?
Honestly, in my honest opinion, it's this entire administration. As we've seen, more and more of our rights are, I wouldn't say being taken away, but they are being strangled, right? They're being squeezed till its very last drop. If our right to protest disappears, it not only puts our right to protest at risk, it puts the right to press at risk too. Because if that amendment is gone, that means nobody has the right to tell any stories. Nobody has the right to speak out against the government. Nobody has the right to actually be what America is, which is a free American with the right to free speech, to assemble and to press.
All right, Alex Burrell and Robert Huffman with Rise Up Media, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Well, coming up, your right to protest, it does have limits.
We talked to an expert about First Amendment restrictions, including where and how you demonstrate. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News.
Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando Frescas.
And I'm Denver7's Micah Smith. This episode, we're focusing on your right to protest, a fundamental freedom that's guaranteed under the First Amendment.
But it's important to know that there are rules about how and where you can protest safely and legally.
With protests popping up across the country in recent months, there's been a lot of questions and confusion about the legal boundaries, like where protests can happen, what it means when demonstrations move into the streets, and how to protect your rights if police get involved.
To help us understand all of it, we're joined now by Darrigan Silver, a professor at the University of Denver who focuses on First Amendment law. He also leads the university's Freedom of Expression and Pluralism Initiative.
Darrigan, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
First question for you. When people gather in public spaces, what are their rights and what limitations exist in terms of protests and demonstrations?
So you absolutely, under the First Amendment, have the right to assemble and the right to protest. It's part of our constitutional history. But as soon as we had the First Amendment, we also had government officials who are looking to restrict expression. And so the history of suppressing protest is just as long as the history of protest. If you look at President Washington, President Adams, they both had very serious protests that they sent federal troops in to deal with. So we have this long history of balancing our right to protest with the right of the government to enact order. What's important to remember is that all regulations by the government must follow certain principles set out by the courts, but really those are influenced by what the courts say they are. We have established some precedents about what should be acceptable and what shouldn't be acceptable. Largely, the government is allowed to introduce what are called time, place, manner restraints. That means they are able to regulate where you protest, when you protest, and how you protest. What they're not allowed to regulate is what you protest. So I'll give you an example. A regulation that says you cannot have protests in downtown Denver between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. on a weeknight, regardless of the content of the protest, it would be considered a content-neutral time, place, manner regulation. What is the purpose of that regulation? Well, it's to keep people off the street during rush hour, right? That is a content-neutral time, place, manner restraint. If I was able to have a regulation, however, that said you are not allowed to have political protests during that time, that now becomes a content-based regulation. I am particularly one particular content, and I'm saying this is not allowed, but other content is. So you want to have a parade celebrating the Nuggets? Go ahead and do it. You want to have a parade about a political issue and you're not allowed? That's now a content-based regulation, and that is not allowed.
I'm thinking of again, the protester who wants to come out and have a sign, and you're going through some very complex things. How do we simplify it for people who want to come out and exercise their First Amendment right to protest?
So typically you have the right to express yourself any way you want in what is called a public forum. So typically your traditional public forums are sidewalks, parks, public spaces that for time immemorial have been set up for people to express themselves. And if you're doing something in that situation that doesn't impede traffic, that doesn't stop people from going about their daily life, and you're just trying to get your message out, you should be perfectly fine, right? If you start doing things that violate laws that are generally applicable to the public, if you walk out into the street, if you stop traffic, whether you have a political message or not, whether you're trying to express yourself or not, that's not going to be protected under the First Amendment, because now you're violating a generally applicable law that really has nothing to do with the content of your speech.
And so, with that, I remember protests, years ago, or even just recently, where masses of people were moving down city streets. The police did not intervene; they were there. So, is that then up to the purview of the police to say we're going to stop this or not, or is there a right to do that?
No, there is no right to do it. So it is the police deciding what's in the best interest of public safety. And sometimes, thinking through things is what good police officers do. They really think about, look, I'm not going to exert force, I'm not going to exert authority simply to do it. I think really good police officers are trained in de-escalation. They're trained in working with individuals. But it's important to remember that a subset of protest is civil disobedience. Now, civil disobedience is a little bit different than a legal peaceful protest, because you're setting out to break the law. Now, traditionally in civil disobedience, it is one, peaceful, and two, the individuals who are participating accept the responsibility of what they're doing. So if you look at the teachings of Martin Luther King, his famous letters from Birmingham jail, he said, don't do this if you cannot serve time in prison. I am engaging in civil disobedience. I am breaking the laws. This has a long history both nationally and internationally, but I'm going to accept the consequence of breaking the law because I am breaking what is an unjust law. That's different than engaging in what our previous guests referred to as bad actors, who sometimes are only looking for media coverage. They're looking for attention. They're looking to bring more awareness to issues, and they're not necessarily willing to do so, one, peacefully, or two, accept the burden of breaking the law.
How does the First Amendment apply on college campuses? We've seen a lot of college campus protests here recently with some consequences.
Absolutely. That's a great question, one I get from my students all the time. Now, if you're at a private university like the University of Denver, where I teach, there is no First Amendment regulation. You cannot say the University of Denver violated my First Amendment rights. The University of Denver is not a state actor. The University of Denver is a private actor. It is the same way if the NBA prevents you from protesting at an NBA game. They're a private actor. There's no First Amendment involved. Now, the University of Denver has adopted a principle of freedom of expression that is very similar to First Amendment principles. So at our university, our chancellor, our board of trustees, and especially our faculty senate have said you have the right to express yourself, and we will follow the rules that are set out by the First Amendment. At a public university like CU Boulder, you are going to have First Amendment rights, but again, those First Amendment rights are not absolute. You can't protest anywhere you want, any way you want. In those situations, you're going to get involved in something that is called the forum doctrine or the public forum doctrine. And in those situations, we're really looking at places. What is the place at a public university where you're protesting? There are places that are perfectly well set up to protest at a university. You know, the quad, open areas, sidewalks. Classrooms are not a place that are set up to protest at a public university. You cannot trespass and say, well, this is a public university and I'm engaging in First Amendment speech, therefore I'm protected from a trespass charge. It doesn't work that way.
And what would you say to people who are afraid of going to a protest and maybe being arrested and not knowing where they fall on that spectrum?
I think you have to understand what your goals are and you have to understand what you're willing to do. Are you willing to go to jail for your beliefs? For some people that answer is yes. For other people they might say, well, I want to express myself, but I don't want to risk going to jail. That's something you need to consider. And then you need to know your rights. You need to know where you're located. You need to know what you're doing. You also do not have a right to not follow the orders of police officers. If a police officer gives a lawful order to disperse, you must disperse. That includes journalists. Journalists who are covering protests do not get special First Amendment rights. They get the First Amendment rights of everybody else.
All right, Derek and Silver, professor at DU, thank you for helping us understand our rights and responsibilities when it comes to protesting.
Thank you very much for having me on. This was a great pleasure.
Awesome. Coming up, what about when it comes to recording police and accessing public records during protests?
We'll hear from the executive director of the Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition on how to protect your rights when documenting demonstrations. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News.
Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando Frescas. As more Coloradans take to local government buildings and community gathering places to protest, we're looking at what exactly your First Amendment rights include.
This episode, we've talked about the freedoms included in your right to assemble and protest, but also some of the limitations in place.
Well, again, the overwhelming majority of protests and marches are peaceful. We have seen a few demonstrations take a turn, whether it be clashes with police or counter-protesters taking advantage of the chaos.
Our next guest is here to help us understand our rights in terms of documenting what's happening around us during demonstrations and accessing media assets after the fact. So Jeff Roberts is the executive director of the Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition, a nonpartisan alliance of groups that promote open access to public records and freedom of the press.
Jeff, thanks so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with open records laws. At times this has been painted as a liberal cause, but there are some bipartisan efforts happening right now in our state to gain access to open records. Can you tell us about those efforts to start?
Sure, and I think access to government information is a nonpartisan, very American cause. That's the way I believe it should be, is everyone has a right to access information about what their government is up to. We've had some efforts in the legislature in the past few years to limit the Colorado Open Records Act, your right to access public records. And the legislature also exempted itself from major portions of the open meetings law. That happened about a year ago. And so because of that, there's been some discussions about whether we need something stronger in the law and perhaps in the state constitution. So there are some discussions going on about whether we should try to initiate a right to know amendment to the Colorado Constitution. There are 8 states that have something like this in their constitutions. The reasons for doing this would be twofold. One, when there are legal disputes about access to information, it gives it a little bit more weight if it's in the Constitution. And then maybe it discourages legislators from trying to dilute those rights.
There's been a little bit of a back and forth lately over if someone can record police, particularly in a protest setting when the situation is tense. Do protesters have a right to record police? If yes, are there restrictions on when and where?
Yeah, you absolutely do have a right to record police. The main thing you have to keep in mind is not to interfere with police as you're doing that. So in 2022, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Colorado and surrounding states, affirmed your right to record police performing their official functions. And other courts of appeals, federal courts of appeals in other parts of the country had done something similar prior to that. 10 years ago, in 2015, the legislature actually passed a law expressly stating that you have a right to record police, and and the only way that police can interfere with that, seizing your phone or the recording without your consent, is if they have a warrant to do so. So, and if that happens, you have the right to initiate a civil action. So that's been in the law, in state law, for 10 years. But now we also have this federal Court of Appeals ruling that really enhances that.
And so we're talking about when people record officers in their normal line of duty. What about police officers recording encounters using their own body cameras? I know right now there are a few court cases going on over who can access that footage. Can you share some insight on that aspect?
Right. So in 2020, following the killings of George Floyd and Elijah McClain here in Colorado, the legislature passed a very wide-ranging law enforcement accountability law. And part of that was not only to require that law enforcement officers wear body cams, but also it included how the public shall be able to access those recordings. And so if there is a complaint of peace officer misconduct, there is more of a right to access those recordings in a timely manner than, say, if it's a recording about some other kind of incident that doesn't involve that. If that is filed, then if somebody makes a request for the footage, then it's supposed to be, unedited footage is supposed to be produced within 21 days. That can be extended if there is an ongoing investigation and they provide some reason that it can't be released quite yet.
What should you do if you feel like your right to access public records is being blocked?
Yeah, well, that's why our organization exists. The Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition is there to help both journalists and the public navigate these laws. And when people do get denials or just want to understand what their rights are, they can contact us. We publish a very extensive guide on our website, which is coloradofoic.org.
All right, Jeff Roberts, the Executive Director of the Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk. And that is this week's episode of Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Every week we have a Real Talk on issues that impact Coloradans who are often overlooked.
You can find all of our shows on denver7.com/realtalk or at cpr.org/realtalk. Have a great day.